Hello and welcome to Recruit and Relax, a recruiting web series. My name is Scott Weissman and I'm a recent graduate of Emory Gazweta Business School. Over the past couple of years, I spent a lot of time thinking about recruiting, whether it was trying to find a job my first year to just giving back my second year. And I want to bring some of this knowledge to you. Like many of you, I applied to business school in part because I wanted to change careers, and I knew the MBA would be a really good avenue to do that. Now, when I started Emory, I knew literally nothing about recruiting and spent a lot of time early on just trying to learn the basics. I mean, the first couple of months was me kind of just fumbling around trying to understand what even goes on here. And when I think back about it, one of my biggest concerns early on was kind of what industries or what companies would even be interested in my background. I mean, I was a psychology major who ended up transitioning to be a CPA in public accounting to finally starting a blockchain advisory firm before school. And there was this decent period of time where I was just questioning whether I can even do this, whether, I could recruit for consulting, which is what I ended up doing, or maybe I should just try to consider different industries. And fortunately, I was successful recruiting, in part because I was able to ask the right questions to the right people and able to craft my story to allow myself to stand out, which I will talk about more in the following episodes. So over the course of this web series, I'm going to bring some knowledge to you and hopefully a whole lot more. So what's the layout of this web series? So I'm actually breaking it into 3 parts. The first part is going to be a 2-episode introduction. So this will be the first episode. And the second episode is going to focus a little bit more in depth on topics that I think are worth talking more about. The second part of the web series is actually going to be interviews with my classmates. What I'm hoping to do is give you a broader perspective of what industries and jobs exist out there and what they might look like. Because a lot of people come to school not knowing which industry they want to recruit for, but it's important to have a better idea of what that can look like early on so that you can start to prepare for that. So I hopefully can bring that to you. And then third is going to be a continuous Q&A series where I'm going to actually ask you guys to submit questions through email that I can answer through this web series and hopefully distribute that information to a broader audience. So let's focus a little bit on this first part, the introduction part. So 2 episodes. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the second episode first. So the second episode is going to be focused on 3 big areas. So resume walkthroughs, star stories, and coffee chats. For many of you, none of those 3 words mean anything currently, and that's completely fine. We'll talk about that a little bit. But these are very important areas which I'm going to dive much more in depth episode 2. So now that's out of the way, let's get back to episode 1 and what this episode's going to be about. So there's a few areas I'm going to talk about. First, recruiting at a high level. Second, what will be different about virtual recruiting? Obviously, this is kind of a hot topic and something that all of you are probably trying to figure out. So I'll give you what I think is going to happen because of this. Third, common terminology to be aware of. Fourth, timelines. Fifth, sources of information, where to go. And then finally, an area that's not discussed enough is the mental aspect of recruiting. All right, so with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so to start, I'm going to talk about recruiting at a high level. And one of the first aspects to be aware of is that recruiting happens actually through a lot of different channels. So what you'll see is generally companies either recruit through school facilitated, also known as on-campus recruiting, or non-school facilitated. So what does that mean? Okay, so school facilitated means that this company recruits through Emory in a sense. They might come to Emory and do a presentation. You will do your resume drop or you will apply to this company through Emory, and the process and the timeline is much more obvious and structured. So through school facilitated recruiting, it's just much more structured of how it works in a lot of senses than non-school facilitated. Do not be alarmed if the industry you're recruiting for is non-school facilitated. It's very common. Recruiting on campus is in many senses very expensive, it's resource intensive. That does not mean that companies that do not recruit on campus don't want Emory students. It just means that they want to use their structured recruiting process. So the 2 big ways to do that happen with non-school facilitated is conferences, which are just huge events where lots of MBAs and lots of companies get together, and you basically we'll do resume drops and you'll kind of get the ball started. So that's kind of important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the second piece, which is also very common, is just networking. So a company has that their application deadline is January 1st, for example. So, you don't want to just have your first interaction with that company dropping a resume. So you'll network with employees from that company, ideally also second years who've worked there, kind of work your way into getting familiar with that company. So when you do submit your resume, somebody at that company is there to go to bat for you and actually say, we should interview this person. So it's important to be aware of that there's a lot of actual ways that recruiting happens. Okay, so kind of taking a step back. You get to campus, probably like some of you are right now. What do? All right. So the first kind of pieces that you're probably going to play with are actually fixing up your resume. That's important just because that starts to kind of become a more important factor pretty early on, and you don't want to just do it last minute. So it's important to adjust your resume for companies, because a resume you submitted for school is obviously a little bit different. The CMC will work with you on that. They'll give you a template you can use, and you'll continue to adjust it from there. And the second piece is kind of you'll start to begin to research industries and companies, and this is important. You'll do that through a lot of different ways. One way that you'll do that is when you kind of begin to network. And early on, networking is very much done with your classmates. So if you have a classmate who worked at a company you're interested in, you might sit down with them and talk about it. Or probably the bigger way is actual second year. So second year MBA students are the people you should be networking with. And they are by far the best source of information because they literally went through the process you're trying to do a year prior. And really nobody has more relevant and better information than them because of that. So those are the people you're going to rely on for, let's say, like 80 to 90% of your questions that you have, just because it's going to be the most relevant. And then kind of as you get a little bit further, you'll start to kind of begin to prepare your stories, the behavioral portion. The reason for that is that they just take a while to develop, especially if you want really good stories. And you also might see that in your kind of networking, coffee chats, that people and alumni might ask you questions about your background that lend itself to your stories. So just be aware of. So that's kind of a very simplistic view of what's going to happen early on. There's a lot more going on, but just kind of break it down. All right, so let's think about kind of the other elements or what this is kind of broken down. So there's two pieces to actually recruiting, if you want to think about it. It is getting the interview, and then it is performing at the interview. So I'm not going to focus a lot about performing on the interview because that comes a little bit later, and the clubs that you'll join in the second years are actually going to help you a lot more with that. Interviews themselves are quite a bit different depending on the industry and company. I don't want to kind of make blanket statements, but in a general sense, you'll kind of see most interviews might have multiple rounds with multiple interviews in each round. They'll have some sort of behavioral component, which is just stories about your background and who you are, and then a technical piece. That technical piece can be anything in the world, so understand what that looks like. So the more relevant thing probably for right now is what can you do to kind of get the interview? And that's made up of a few things. It's a combination of your resume, and not just the piece of paper that you turn in, but also your ability to communicate that and make somebody interested in your background and showcase your skill set. So it's well beyond just the piece of paper to think about. Also networking. So not only networking with second years, but eventually over time starting to network with alumni at those companies so that when you do drop your resume, somebody is there to kind of go to bat for you and say, okay, I want this person to get an interview. And then finally, unfortunately, there's a little bit of luck involved. Just to be aware of, like, if something doesn't go your way, luck is a piece of the puzzle and you have to be aware of it. So that's recruiting at a high level. There's a lot more to go along with it. You'll have more questions. That's great. I'm happy to try to answer those in the Q&A, or you should start asking your second years or the CMC. Okay, so now the big question that I'm sure a lot of you are stressed out about and thinking about is that what will be different with virtual recruiting? And I'm going to kind of apply this to recruiting at a high level. There's obviously going to be small details that are different, but the first thing is that companies are going to recruit. They're not going to stop recruiting due to what's going on. And that's largely because when you think about what companies are doing for internship recruiting is they're projecting the need 2 years out. And that's something super difficult to do. And most companies are not going to drastically change recruiting patterns because of what's going on in the world now to project out 2 years. There's going to be some variation to this in some specific cases, like if you were dead set on going into the cruise industry, you might have to adjust that. But for the most part, most companies are not going to change this process or change the number of students they're looking for or anything like that. So hopefully that should make you feel a little bit more comfortable that the opportunities will exist for you. It's just going to be about getting those, which in some senses could be a little bit more challenging, but I think there's also opportunities for you to lean into the digital aspect that could be beneficial for you. So let's talk about getting the interview and the interview itself. So these things I think are not going to change a whole lot because of the virtual element. So let me talk about that a little bit more. So getting the interview, combination I told you about, the resume, networking, and luck. Resume is virtual anyway. It's a PDF document. You're going to drop it on the company's website. That's not going to change. Networking, I actually, in some senses, will be a little bit different. Networking with second years, because a lot of that's done on campus, will be different. I'll talk about that in a second. But networking with alumni, I actually think could be better. When I think about my networking with alumni, I can maybe count on one hand how many coffee chats I had with an alumni that were in person. Almost all of them were phone calls. And to be honest, I didn't love that because alumni are busy, they're doing other things, and it's really difficult to, keep their attention for long periods of time and know what they're doing. So, they could get distracted and stop paying attention. If it's a Zoom call, it's just less likely. You can also read their body language. So I actually think the virtual networking with alumni is actually better than just the phone calls. So that should be something good. And then when I think about the actual interview, companies are familiar with virtual interviews. I don't think any company this will be the first time they've done virtual interviews. A number of my second round interviews were actually virtual. You obviously need to do things slightly different through that interview, but for the most part, it's not going to be something new. So companies are going to be aware about it. And there's also a path for preparation that you can be aware of and on the front end prepare towards that. So I think those things are fine. So that doesn't mean there aren't going to be differences. The two big differences I see and I think about my time about where virtual would have been a little bit difficult is getting the information you need, and very specifically early on. As I kind of talked about, the most valuable resource is the second years. So you need to make sure that you feel comfortable enough to reach out to them to then start to have conversations with them. And if they're not on campus, that's just a little bit more of feeling uncomfortable about reaching out. And I know for myself, the people I reached out to early on for those conversations were people that I had had a previous conversation with on campus or run into, or at least kind of like knew a little bit. But that's not to say that you're not going to be able to get that information. You're just going to have to be more proactive in reaching out to people that you may have never spoken to. And trust me, the second years are completely okay with that. Nobody's going to be like, who are you? I'm not talking to you. You just have to reach out, even if you're uncomfortable. And the second piece is actually preparing for the interviews. And that's just because a lot of that happens kind of organically. You're in class with a classmate and you're like, hey, do you want to spend 10 minutes after class, running through our resume walkthroughs? And you might do that. Or do you want a case really quickly? And that's going to be a lot more difficult, or maybe not a lot more, but you're going to have to prepare for that on the front end. You're going to have to schedule that stuff. So all these things are things that are very much overcome with preparation and awareness of what is going to be different. So out of everything about the MBA experience, I think recruiting is one of the things that's probably going to be the least different in terms of how it's going to work, and it's going to transfer the best to a virtual environment. So just be aware you're going to have to be a little bit more proactive in certain areas and prepare that way. But if you do that, you will see the same success as every other group of individuals in every other class. Okay, so next is common terminology, and I want to go through this kind of quickly just because I'm going to use some of these words and some of my classmates are going to use some of these words, and I've honestly used most of these already. So OCR, on-campus recruiting, I think the term will now be school facilitated, just companies and industries who go through the school to recruit. Next, CASE. CASE is generally associated with consulting, but I will say that in more recent years, casing has been brought into other industries, so do be aware of that. And you will be well prepared for that on the front end if you listen to the clubs and listen to students. So CASE is basically at a broad level, it's a situation or a question that the interviewer is going to ask you, and what they want to see is how do you think about the situation and kind of break it down to think about how we would move forward. It's a very basic way of thinking about it, but I'm happy to discuss that further on when we get, much further in recruiting where casing is actually something relevant. Similarly, along those same lines, technical questions. That's investment banking more so. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I'm not an expert, but essentially it's a variety of financial information that you want to be aware of prior to your interview and prior to even your coffee chats that you want to show you have a general understanding of to kind of go into investment banking. So the finance club will prepare you for that. They will tell you exactly what you need to know. Do not be concerned about that right this second, but it is something that you want to be aware of going forward. Okay. Next, the CMC, Career Management Center. They will help you with a variety of things. We'll say is like they can be very valuable if you have an idea of what you're asking and what you're trying to get out of them. If you don't, then it's obviously going to be difficult for anyone to help. So just be aware of what they can be helpful with and use them accordingly. National Black, it's a conference. It's the largest conference. If your industry recruits heavily at that, certainly go. That'll be talked about a lot more. Company presentations, these are just presentations that companies put on, through, I guess they'll probably be through Zooms invites this year. Be aware of them. You can sign up for them. That leads me into Go. The Go portal is just where on-campus recruiting happens. GCC, it's actually kind of important, it's like the big Emory event where, you do your first kind of preparation for recruiting, and it's like your big, okay, I'm here, I'm trying to recruit piece. And so in the past, it's been at the aquarium, and basically what they'll do is they'll have a bunch of different companies come, they'll break you all down into like groups of 4 or 5. And what you'll do is you'll sit in a circle and you'll kind of go through your resume walkthrough and ask questions of that company. They'll probably do it with breakout groups on Zoom this year, so kind of similar structure. Obviously, you're not going to be sitting at tables. And the last 3 things, which I'm going to talk about in much more depth in episode 2, are STAR stories, also known as behaviorals, resume walkthrough, and coffee chats. I'm going to talk about those a lot more in episode 2, so I'm not going to talk about them more here. All right. So next thing, timelines. Timelines are very important. Different industries recruit on a different timeline. You want to be aware of that because there's a lot of different things that can come up. Clubs should provide you what those timelines look like, but be aware different companies recruit on different timelines, different industries or different timelines. Also be aware of just different events and what timeline that looks like. So when is GCC? When is National Black? Those are questions you should figure out somewhat early on so that you can mark them on your calendar, and then you can say at that date I need this done. Trust me, everything gets overwhelming at a certain point, especially when you throw core onto it. So you want to figure out the timelines early on so you can prepare early and stretch things out. Trust me, recruiting does not lend itself to last minute preparation at all. It does not do well if you try to prepare last minute, so give yourself time to prepare. That's all I'm going to kind of say about timelines, but I'll actually discuss timelines more in depth when I speak to my classmates because they will talk about the timelines for their industries. All right, next. Sources of information. I know I'm kind of rushing through some of this, but I just want to get this information out to you. Sources of information, CMC, Career Management Center. They'll help you, especially early on, start to get some awareness of what companies come to campus, how to go through it, get your resume going. They also do workshops for your behavioral preparation, your resume walkthrough, so be aware of that. Most useful source is going to be second years. Certainly use them as much as possible. That is how I was successful through recruiting, is my second years were able to give me the information I needed to set myself up for success. Going a little bit further, recent alumni, such as myself, we have a lot of relevant information to help you with. Second years are probably going to be more beneficial because it's just the most real time, but we can also provide a lot of information to you because we also recently went through the process. When you get to alumni or company employees that are a little bit further out, the information that they're going to give you is much less specific about the recruiting process and much more about the company as a whole, and what it's like working there, what their experiences are, and things like that. So just be aware of, you're going to be asking different questions to different levels of employees of a company. The more recent they are to joining, the more awareness they are about them recruiting because they just did it more recently. Employees who have been in the company for multiple years, they probably, for the most part, don't know the recruiting process unless they're actively involved in it. So just to be aware of it. Websites. So what I'll say about websites is they can be extremely valuable, but always verify the information. Companies recruit differently at different schools. And so if you read something online about, oh, this company does X, Y, and Z, it might not be applicable to Emory. Just to be completely honest, every company does it a little bit differently, but they can be valuable in certain instances. But always verify that information with people who have more relevant information, which is your second years. And finally, clubs. Clubs are extremely beneficial. They're going to basically put you through a very structured process of preparing and setting yourself up for success. If you're even remotely interested in an industry, you should join that club, learn more, and if you want to continue to pursue that, stay and obviously listen to what they say. They're going to tell you how to be successful. They were very beneficial for me. Okay, so those are kind of the big topics. One topic that I do want to discuss that isn't discussed enough, in my opinion, is just the mental aspect or the mental toll of recruiting. So for many of you, and similar to myself, you came to get an MBA because you wanted to change careers and you really wanted to, enter an industry that maybe wasn't possible previously to getting an MBA. And that was certainly true for myself. And because of that, you put a lot of stress on yourself to be successful. And it's not a bad thing. We're high-performing individuals. We all want to be successful. But what I'll be cautioned is that nobody is going to be successful and perfect 100% of the time. You're going to see failures, and you're also going to see success. It's going to be an up and down process, and you need to recognize that on the front end. I had my good days, I had my bad days. Some days I felt like I was getting crushed, and some days I was elated. And I recognized I began to recognize over time that I'm just going to see these ups and downs. I'm going to have to prepare for that myself. And that leads me into this next piece that I think is really, really important and something that took me a while to understand, was you really need to own yourself. And what I mean is that you need to recognize what you bring to the table and what makes you special. So you can't change your background. Even though you might want to try, it's just not what you can do. And so what you need to do is understand that you can't change the actual specifics, but what you can work on and what you can change is how you present it and how you communicate that to others. And that was something that took me a really long time to understand and caused me a ton of stress and anxiety because I was just so I just wanted to be successful so bad, but I didn't really know how I could do that. And so fortunately, I sat down with a few individuals. One of them was one of my professors, and we talked through this and really what kind of changed my outlook for recruiting and really got me from, my point of being anxious and really questioning everything about myself and being stressed was this idea that I can't change those things, but I can put in a lot of time and effort to make myself and to showcase myself and who I truly believe I am and what I represent. And so I will caution all of you to understand that you can't change your past, but you can showcase who you are through that. And I can honestly say, all of you gone to Emory, you're all phenomenal individuals. Any company that you recruit for would be lucky to have you. So understand that you're not competing with your classmates. You are all a team. Don't compare yourself to others. Compare yourself to what you can represent of who you are. So do spend some time thinking about that and making sure that the person sitting across from you has a really good idea of what you bring to the table. And if you do that in a great way, the background is not going to be the important aspect. It's going to be what you're bringing to the table, and they'll recognize that. So with that being said, that is it for episode 1, and I hope you join me for episode 2. It'll be quite a bit shorter. So thank you very much.